The relationship between the United States and China has always been bittersweet, mostly bitter, and a hot topic in global politics. Just before the historic Biden-Xi talks on controlling nuclear weapons, China made some demands to the U.S. that might stop these talks before they even begin. These demands were put forward during a meeting between the officials of both countries on November 6th last year. The U.S. Department of State didn't share much, only saying they discussed maintaining stability and avoiding a big race to get more nuclear weapons. However, China's newspaper, the Global Times, had an article listing exactly what China wants. The first demand is straightforward yet challenging. The U.S. must acknowledge China's rapidly growing nuclear arsenal. This demand immediately poses a big problem for the U.S. In October 2023, the Pentagon released a report showing that China's nuclear expansion is much faster than they previously thought. The report also mentioned that China is closely observing the Russian-Ukraine conflict, likely to learn what mistakes to avoid in case of a potential conflict with Taiwan in the future. The statistics are alarming, showing China's swift increase in nuclear capabilities, which is a concern for anyone wary of nuclear destruction. Back in 2000, China had around 230 nuclear weapons, much fewer than the US, which had over 8,300. However, in the past 23 years, while the US has been reducing its nuclear stockpile, China has been doing the opposite. In January 2023, the US had 5,428 nuclear weapons, having decommissioned about 3,000 from its arsenal. Meanwhile, China has been increasing its number of nuclear weapons. From 230 in 2000, it has grown to 500 operational warheads by 2023, and there's no sign of slowing down. According to the Pentagon, China is expected to have 1,000 warheads by 2030 and could reach up to 1,500 5 years later. This rapid growth in China's nuclear arsenal could pose significant challenges to the U.S. defense strategy concerning China. Despite the U.S. reducing its nuclear arsenal, it still has far more nuclear weapons than China. Even if China reaches 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035, it will still be far behind the U.S. in terms of the total number of nuclear weapons. China's point is straightforward. The U.S. has a huge number of nuclear weapons, and China is just trying to catch up to ensure it's on equal footing. The issue becomes a point of contention. China wants to continue increasing its nuclear weapons, arguing it's merely trying to match the U.S.'s larger arsenal. This demand might also hint at China's broader military goals, which conflict with U.S. geopolitical objectives. Yet, China might claim that aiming for nuclear parity doesn't necessarily mean it intends to use these weapons aggressively. China's second major demand is for the U.S. to agree to a no-first-use (NFU) policy regarding nuclear weapons. According to Hu Zijin's opinion piece in the Global Times, China is dedicated to its NFU policy, insisting that its nuclear arsenal serves solely as a deterrent to prevent attacks on Beijing. An NFU policy means a country promises not to use nuclear weapons as a first strike or as a preemptive action against an anticipated nuclear attack from another country. China is unique among nuclear-armed nations in maintaining an unconditional commitment to NFU. The United States, on the other hand, does not adhere to an NFU policy and has not ruled out being the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict. China's adherence to an NFU policy means it does not have the same flexibility, potentially placing it at a strategic disadvantage in a conflict with the U.S. This demand from China is logical from its perspective, as it seeks to ensure that it is not at a unilateral disadvantage in its nuclear strategy compared to the U.S. China reasserting its no-first-use NFU policy during discussions can be seen as an attempt to encourage the U.S. to adopt a similar stance. If China could get the U.S. to agree to an NFU policy, it would move closer to achieving parity, with both nations publicly committed to not using nuclear weapons against each other first. This parity is crucial for China's strategy of being seen as an equal nuclear power to the U.S. However, concerns arose from a report published by the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, in October 2023. The report discusses a Chinese proposal for new global order, which conspicuously omits any mention of its NFU policy. This omission is noteworthy because China has maintained its NFU policy since 1964 and has been consistent in its application. Despite continually framing it in ways that suggest it applies only to non-nuclear states, the absence of NFU in this recent proposal could indicate a shift in China's stance on nuclear weapons, suggesting a potential departure from its long-standing policy. This situation presents a dilemma. On the surface, China continues to promote its NFU policy, possibly using it as leverage to encourage the U.S. to make a similar public commitment. Yet, the omission of NFU from its proposal on global governance hints at a behind-the-scenes re-evaluation of this commitment. This could be a strategic move by China, aiming to bind the U.S. to an NFU policy while subtly moving away from its own, thus gaining a strategic advantage. China's third demand, as stated by Hu Zijin, is for the U.S. to stop expanding its nuclear capabilities, which are already at a high level. He argues that a commitment to further reductions in nuclear arsenals should be the basis for any meaningful arms control agreements. This demand cleverly leverages the U.S. recent commitment to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT, on July 31st, which aims to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and achieve total nuclear disarmament eventually. China can also point to the New START treaty between the U.S. and Russia, which commits the U.S. to reduce its deployed strategic nuclear warheads to no more than 1,550, as evidence that the U.S. should not expand further. The U.S., with its 5,428 nuclear weapons, appears to be close to this limit, with only 1,744 actively deployed, according to the Nuclear Threat Initiative, NTI. This number is slightly over the New START Treaty's limit, but close enough for the U.S. to argue compliance. However, the U.S. also has about 1,950 nuclear weapons in reserve, not ready for immediate deployment, but available if needed. This large reserve could undermine U.S. claims of commitment to nuclear disarmament, as it suggests a readiness to expand the arsenal if necessary. China could argue that the U.S.'s large reserve of nuclear weapons contradicts its supposed commitment to reducing its nuclear stockpiles and does not align with the spirit of the New START Treaty's reduction goals. So China's demand that the U.S. halt any expansion and further reduce its nuclear arsenal is positioned as a call for genuine commitment to disarmament, challenging the U.S. to align its actions with its treaty obligations and public commitments to nuclear arms control. While China might argue that the U.S. effectively has around 3,700 active nuclear weapons, significantly more than the 1,550 caps agreed upon in treaties, the U.S. has counter-arguments highlighting its reduction efforts. Historically, the U.S. nuclear arsenal peaked in 1967 during the Cold War, with over 31,255 warheads. Since then, the U.S. has significantly reduced its stockpile, suggesting a commitment to decreasing its nuclear capabilities, not expanding them. However, the discussion becomes more complex when addressing the issue of modernization. China could claim that despite the reduction in numbers, the U.S. is enhancing its nuclear capabilities through modernization efforts. The U.S. is indeed updating its nuclear arsenal, with projects like the LGM-35A Sentinel ICBM, the B-21 Raider stealth bomber, and the replacement of Ohio-class submarines with Columbia-class ones in the 2030s. China views this modernization as an expansion of nuclear capabilities, arguing that improving the effectiveness of nuclear weapons constitutes an increase in nuclear power. Also, the presence of U.S. nuclear weapons in foreign countries adds another layer to the debate. The U.S. has nuclear weapons stationed in Europe, and while China might not express concern over European deployments, it is apprehensive about U.S. nuclear capabilities in close proximity to its borders, such as in Japan and South Korea. The suggestion by former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe that Japan consider hosting U.S. nuclear weapons highlighted China's concerns. Japan should consider hosting U.S. nuclear weapons heightened China's concerns. Despite Abe's subsequent assassination and the current status of U.S.-Japanese military relations, this situation underscores the complexity of nuclear negotiations where numbers, modernization, and geographic deployment all play critical roles in the strategic balance. In July 2023, the U.S. sent a nuclear-armed submarine to South Korea for the first time in over 4 decades, a move reported by the Associated Press as a deterrent against North Korea's nuclear advancements. However, from China's perspective, this deployment close to its borders signifies U.S. military expansion. If Japan also decided to host American nuclear weapons, China would face increased military pressure in its region. China's argument against U.S. expansion is three-pronged. First, it contends that maintaining over 3,000 nuclear warheads, even if many are in reserve, could be seen as violating the New START Treaty, representing an expansion rather than the reduction of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. Second, the U.S.'s efforts to modernize its nuclear capabilities are viewed by China as another form of expansion, enhancing the U.S.'s nuclear strike capabilities. Third, cooperation with South Korea and Japan on nuclear matters could further encroach on China's regional security, exacerbating its strategic concerns. The fourth demand from China, as articulated by Hu Jijin, urges the U.S. to exercise more caution in its alliances, particularly highlighting the U.S.'s support for Australia's deployment of nuclear submarines. This is seen as setting a dangerous precedent for nuclear proliferation. The AUKUS agreement, which includes the U.S. supplying Australia with nuclear-powered submarines, is a point of contention. While these submarines are not nuclear-armed, the deal raises concerns in China about a potential increase in nuclear capabilities among U.S. allies in the Asia-Pacific region. China perceives the U.S.'s involvement with Australia, along with its security ties to South Korea and Japan, as creating strategic encirclement that could potentially bring U.S. nuclear weapons closer to Chinese borders. Thus, China's demand for the U.S. to rein in its allies is essentially a call for the U.S. to avoid actions that could be interpreted as efforts to make these countries nuclear capable, thereby preventing any U.S. nuclear assets from moving closer to China. This reflects China's strategic calculus to maintain regional stability and deter perceived U.S. military expansion into the Asia-Pacific. China is working on making its military stronger in other places around the world. For example, it's been reported that China wants to build new Navy bases in countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan. This would add to the military base it already has in Djibouti, Africa. Another report says China is spending money on improving a Navy base in Cambodia, but many think this is more about China making itself stronger in that area than about helping Cambodia. While China is doing this, it's also telling the U.S. to be careful about how it works with its friends, like helping Australia get submarines that can run on nuclear power. This seems a bit unfair because China is also making moves to be stronger around the world. However, China's projects are mostly about ships and not about nuclear weapons. This lets China say it's not doing the same thing as the U.S., even though submarines can carry nuclear weapons. Some people think China's request for the U.S. to watch its allies more closely might be a way to distract from its own plans to get stronger in the sea. Later on, this could lead to China working with other countries on nuclear stuff, which would be a big problem for the U.S. There's also a bigger discussion about getting rid of nuclear weapons. A person from a group that wants to get rid of nuclear weapons said, both the U.S. and China aren't really trying hard enough to reduce their nuclear weapons. This group noted that neither country has signed a big agreement that many other countries have joined to say no to nuclear weapons. So, while China is asking the U.S. to do certain things, like not making its nuclear weapons better and working closely with its friends, China is also making its military stronger and could be planning to work with other countries on nuclear things. This makes some people think that China is being a bit hypocritical because it's doing things it's telling the U.S. not to do. But the fact that China and the U.S. are talking about these issues is a good sign. It shows they're willing to have a conversation, which hasn't always been easy in the past. Now, people are watching to see if these talks will lead to any good changes or if they're just for show. The big question is whether China's requests are fair or just a way to shift attention from its own actions.